At my own Mother's Day dinner, I raised a glass of wine to my lips, knowing my only daughter had just poisoned it. She smiled at me, thinking I was just a frail old woman standing between her and my inheritance, willing to kill me just to keep up her perfect appearances. But she forgot one thing. I was a retired bank manager, and I was about to use her own greed to deliver a form of justice so perfect it would destroy everything she ever cared about. The air in the restaurant was thick with the scent of money and lilies, a combination that always felt more like a funeral home than a place to celebrate. It was Mother's Day, and my daughter Jolie had insisted on this place, a stuffy Michelin-starred mausoleum in the heart of Westchester. The pleasantries felt as starched as the white tablecloths. Jolie was practically vibrating with a frantic energy, her smile stretched so tight I worried it might snap. She kept telling me how much she loved me, how important this day was, her words tumbling out in a breathless rush. Across the table, her husband Mark was a statue of misery, his gaze fixed on his water glass, as if it held the answers to the universe. As a retired bank manager, I'd spent 40 years reading people who were trying to hide something, and the two of them were practically screaming desperation. Then came the wine. Jolie presented the bottle with a flourish, a vintage she claimed she'd spent weeks hunting down. She said it was just for me, a special token to show her appreciation. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured a glass the ruby liquid, catching the light of the crystal chandelier above us. I smiled a warm, maternal smile I'd perfected over the decades, while a cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. As Jolie placed the glass in front of me, I noticed a young waiter clearing the adjacent table. He was trying to be invisible, as good waiters are, but his eyes darted towards me wide with a panic that was impossible to fake. He gave his head the slightest, almost imperceptible shake. My blood ran cold. I've always been observant, a trait that served me well in my career. I noticed the details people think are hidden. And this boy's terror was a detail I couldn't ignore. I gave a small nod, acknowledging Jolie's gift, my gaze still locked on the waiter. He chose his moment perfectly. Under the guise of wiping a non-existent spot from our table, he leaned in his voice a feather-light whisper against the clatter of silverware. He told me he saw her put something in my glass in the kitchen. He begged me not to drink it, to just pretend. Then just as quickly he was gone, leaving me alone with the horrifying knowledge he'd just handed me. The entire world seemed to shrink to the circumference of that wine glass. The murmur of the restaurant faded to a dull roar in my ears. This symbol of my daughter's love, this expensive, carefully chosen vintage, was now a potential instrument of my death. Every forced smile, every anxious glance from Jolie and Mark suddenly snapped into a terrifying, crystal-clear focus. My mind, the one thing I've always trusted, began to race, connecting the dots with the cold, brutal efficiency of an adding machine. Their frantic energy, their financial secrecy over the past year, their suffocating attention. It was all a prelude to this. A tremor started in my soul, a deep, seismic shock of betrayal. But my hand, when I raised the glass, was perfectly steady. 40 years of dealing with liars and cheats had taught me how to build a mask for any occasion. I smiled at my daughter, the woman I had raised, the child I had loved more than my own life. I brought the glass to my lips and pretended to take a small, delicate sip. Just enough touched my tongue for me to know the truth. It was bitter, a sharp, metallic tang that coated my palate. It was the taste of poison, the taste of betrayal. I lowered the glass, my smile never wavering, and looked directly into Jolie's hopeful, terrified eyes. I told her it was delicious that she'd chosen perfectly. My voice was even betraying none of the chaos raging inside me. Then I raised my glass again. I told her we should have a toast to family. The smile of pure, unadulterated relief that washed over my daughter's face was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my 61 years of life. In that moment, the warm, loving mother she knew died, and something else, something colder and much, much stronger was born in her place. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. The rest of that dinner was a masterclass in performance. I smiled, I ate my salmon, I nodded along to Jolie's frantic chatter about her garden club and the new SUV she was thinking about. Every motion was deliberate, every word a carefully chosen stone to rebuild the wall of normalcy they had tried to shatter. I left that restaurant with my daughter's kiss on my cheek, the warmth of her lips a grotesque counterpoint to the ice in my veins. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark of my living room, the silence of the house a roaring in my ears, and I let the shock give way to a cold, crystalline rage. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a declaration of war. And I had no intention of losing. The next morning, I made my first move. I waited until 10 o'clock, a perfectly reasonable time for a casual call. When Jolie answered, her voice was still laced with that cloying false sweetness from the night before. I kept my own tone light, telling her I'd been chatting with my old friend Margaret, the one who fancies herself a wine connoisseur. I told her Margaret was so intrigued by the unique vintage I'd described that she was desperate to know the vineyard and the year. I asked Jolie if she could just snap a quick picture of the bottle's label and send it over to me. It was a simple, innocent request. It was also a perfectly calibrated explosive. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, then a stammer. Jolie said she'd already thrown the bottle out in the recycling. Her voice was an octave too high. I could almost hear her heart hammering against her ribs. I just hummed thoughtfully, telling her it was no matter, just a silly question. But I knew they would have gotten rid of that bottle the second they got home. My simple question had just forced her to lie, and a bad lie at that. That was the first crack in their facade. The second came just a few hours later. It was Mark who called this time, his voice oozing a practiced sincerity that set my teeth on edge. He said Jolie had mentioned my question, and he wanted to clarify just in case I was trying to track down another bottle for myself. He launched into a ridiculously detailed story about how he'd been carrying the recycling bin out that morning, tripped on the porch step, and the bin had gone flying, shattering the lone wine bottle against the curb. It was a preposterous, clumsy lie, filled with unnecessary details that screamed fabrication. A single, unified lie might have been clever. Two conflicting, panicked lies told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a desperate, spur-of-the-moment act. This was planned. They were amateurs, and they were terrified. I knew then that my own intuition, as sharp as it was, wasn't enough. I needed a professional. I needed someone who operated in the shadows, someone who knew how to dig up the secrets people buried deep. My mind went back 20 years to my time as a bank manager dealing with a high-stakes embezzlement case. The bank had brought in a specialist, a quiet, ruthlessly efficient man named David Chen. He was a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud, a bloodhound who could smell a lie through 6 feet of concrete. I still had his number in an old Rolodex, a relic from another era. I made the call. His voice hadn't changed, calm, precise, and discreet. I didn't tell him about the wine. I didn't tell him about the attempted murder. The words wouldn't even form in my mouth. Instead, I stuck to the language I knew best: finance. I told him I had reason to suspect my daughter and her husband were in catastrophic financial trouble and were hiding it from me. I told him I needed a complete, off-the-books workup of their entire financial lives, assets, liabilities, credit lines, everything. I authorized his fee without a second thought. My first ally was now in place. As if on cue, Jolie and Mark's panic sent them directly to my doorstep. That afternoon, they showed up unannounced, their arms laden with groceries I didn't need. They started a campaign of suffocating care. Jolie insisted on cleaning my kitchen. Mark offered to fix a loose railing on my porch that wasn't broken. From then on, one of them was at my house every single day. If my phone rang, Jolie would rush to pick it up, asking who was calling with a bright, false smile. They told me they were just worried about me, that I had seemed a bit tired after our rich dinner. But I saw it for what it was. This wasn't care. This was surveillance. They were spooked, terrified of what I might know or who I might talk to. The gilded cage was locking around me, but they didn't realize I was the one who had just forged the key. The danger was escalating, but so was my resolve. They thought they were watching a frail old woman. They had no idea they were dealing with a predator. An animal caught in a trap will either chew its own leg off to escape or lie perfectly still, feigning death. I chose the latter. I began to play the part they had cast for me, the frail, slightly confused mother, utterly dependent on their sudden, suffocating kindness. I thanked Jolie profusely for bringing me homemade soup. I allowed Mark to change a light bulb that wasn't burnt out. When they were there, I would move a little slower, my voice a little weaker. I even developed a lingering headache, which I told them with a sigh of weary gratitude must have been from that incredibly strong wine she'd served me. I saw a flicker of something in Jolie's eyes, fear, satisfaction, but she quickly masked it. My apparent submission was working. It was lulling them into a false sense of security, making them believe their secret was perfectly safe. They thought they had me under control, but in reality, they were the ones in the cage, and they hadn't even noticed the bars yet. Of course, what I didn't know at the time was the true depth of their desperation. I couldn't see the scene playing out in their meticulously decorated home across town, where the perfect facade was crumbling into dust. I couldn't see the registered letter from the bank lying on their granite countertop, its bold red letters screaming past due. I couldn't see my daughter, her face pale and drawn, frantically typing Prestige Capital Ventures into her laptop, the search results painting a grim picture of a collapsed Ponzi scheme. The slick investment manager, who had promised them guaranteed 30% returns, preying on their desperate need to keep up with their wealthier neighbors, had vanished, taking their life savings and the money from a secret second mortgage with him. Their perfect suburban life was a house of cards, and a gale force wind was blowing. The clock was ticking down to total financial and social ruin, and that sound had become louder to them than a mother's heartbeat. While they thought I was napping, lulled into a stupor by their poisoned love, I was wide awake. My home office, a room they hadn't bothered to enter, became my war room. The mind that had managed a multi-million-dollar bank branch for 40 years was now focused on a single, hostile takeover, my own life. I pulled out decades of old tax returns, property deeds, and financial statements I'd kept with meticulous care. On a new encrypted laptop I'd had delivered, I put my knowledge of banking systems to work. I ran public records searches, looking for liens against their property. A second mortgage taken out 8 months ago from a high-risk lender. A series of maxed-out credit cards. I was mapping their financial prison cell by cell, and the picture that emerged was one of pure, unadulterated panic. They weren't just broke, they were on the verge of an abyss. Their growing confidence in my ignorance made them careless. That was the mistake I was counting on. It came on a Thursday. Jolie was fluffing the pillows on my sofa, chattering away about some petty drama at the country club. Then, in a tone she tried to make sound casual, she started complaining about the rising cost of living and how important it was to have one's affairs in order. She asked me as if the thought had just popped into her head where I kept my will. She said she was just thinking for the future it would be responsible for her and Mark to have the contact information for my estate lawyer. My heart didn't even flutter. There it was, the end game laid bare by her own greedy impatience. The failed poisoning was just step one. Accessing my inheritance was the final goal. I gave her a weak smile and told her it was a morbid thought and that we had plenty of time to worry about such things. But I logged the information away. It was the final piece of evidence I needed. She had just confirmed her motive, and in doing so handed me the very weapon I would use to dismantle her world. For a week, I was a ghost in my own home, a masterclass in fragility. I allowed Jolie to fuss over me, to screen my calls, to essentially place me under house arrest, disguised as loving care. I played my part, and they played theirs, never realizing that with each passing day, David Chen's investigation was tightening like a noose around their gilded lives. While Jolie was fluffing my pillows, David was pulling property records. While Mark was bringing me groceries, David was tracing the source of their second mortgage. The final report he sent me was a digital tombstone for their entire life, a detailed account of the Prestige Capital Ventures, Ponzi scheme, the fraudulent mortgage application, and the string of maxed-out credit cards. The picture was complete. I knew their secret, and now it was time for them to know mine. The plan was set for a Tuesday afternoon. David was to make his move at 2:00 p.m. I was to wait for his signal. The minutes ticked by, each one a lifetime. I sat in my quiet house, a predator, waiting for the trap to spring. My phone buzzed at precisely 2:17 p.m. It was a single text from David: "The dam has broken." I didn't rush. I calmly picked up my car keys, my hands as steady as a surgeon's. The drive to their house was surreal. The sun was shining, people were walking their dogs, the world was carrying on as if nothing monumental was happening. But I knew better. I was driving toward the epicenter of an earthquake I had started. I let myself in with the key. They'd insisted I keep the irony thick enough to taste. The front door was unlocked. The scene I walked in on was one of utter devastation. My daughter Jolie, the picture of suburban perfection, was crumpled on her designer sofa. Her face a mess of tears and mascara. Mark was pacing the floor like a caged animal, his face white with terror. And standing calmly in the middle of it all, briefcase in hand, was David Chen. He'd done exactly as I'd instructed. He had arrived unannounced, presenting himself as a risk assessment consultant for their mortgage underwriter. The official-looking documents he'd placed on their coffee table were a masterful bluff, detailing the exact fraudulent information they had used to secure their loan. It was enough to shatter them. I stood in the doorway listening as the last of Jolie's confession poured out of her in a torrent of broken sobs. She revealed everything. The slick scam artist who had preyed on their ambition, the catastrophic loss of their savings, the secret second mortgage that was now in foreclosure. She confessed the unbearable pressure of keeping up appearances in a community that judges failure like a mortal sin. And then came the words that stopped my heart even though I was expecting them. She admitted that killing me, that getting access to the inheritance had felt like the only way out, the only way to stop the public humiliation that terrified her more than anything else in the world. The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. And then, the pathetic conspiracy between them fractured under the weight of the truth. Mark, the silent, terrified accomplice, finally found his voice. He turned on Jolie, his fear curdling into rage, blaming her for being so naive, for believing the scammer's promises, for dragging him into her mess. Their unity, built on a foundation of shared panic, dissolved into a flurry of bitter, ugly accusations. They were no longer partners in crime. They were two drowning rats fighting over the last piece of driftwood. That was my cue. I stepped out of the entryway and into the living room. The bickering stopped instantly. The look on their faces, first confusion, then a dawning, sickening horror as they saw me standing there calm and composed, was a memory I will carry with me forever. They looked at David, then back at me, their minds failing to comprehend what was happening. I let the silence stretch, letting their terror build. I looked at my weeping, broken daughter and her pathetic, blame-shifting husband. Then I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. I told them the bank didn't send him. I did. The last bit of color drained from their faces. In that moment, the power dynamic of our entire lives shifted, cracking and reforming like polar ice. I was no longer the frail mother, the victim, the obstacle to be removed. I was the architect of their ruin, the holder of all their secrets, the one in complete control. I walked further into the room, my presence dominating the space. I laid out my terms with the cold precision of a bank manager closing a defaulted loan. I told them they would not speak to anyone. They would not move a single dollar from any account. And in 2 days, they would attend a family meeting at my house where everything would be settled. They were left powerless, stripped of all their lies and defenses, utterly terrified of the judgment that was to come. And for the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe again. The 2 days I gave them were a study in silence. They didn't call. They didn't text. It was a silence born not of peace, but of pure terror. They were waiting for their sentencing, and I was the judge, jury, and executioner. I used that time to prepare, not emotionally, but professionally. I met with my estate lawyer, a sharp woman who had handled my affairs for years. I made the necessary arrangements, my signature on the documents as firm and steady as my resolve. The grief for the daughter I thought I had was a separate thing, a quiet ache I would deal with later. This was business. On the appointed day, I arranged my formal living room not as a place of comfort, but as a boardroom, a private courtroom. When Jolie and Mark arrived, they looked like ghosts, their faces pale and hollowed out. They sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, not daring to touch the plush cushions. They were defendants, and they knew it. A few minutes later, the final party arrived, my brother Robert. Robert is 10 years my senior, a retired lawyer with a spine of steel and a reputation for unimpeachable integrity. He is the patriarch of our family, the keeper of its honor. He looked at Jolie and Mark with concern, assuming I had called him here to mediate some terrible but mundane family squabble. He had no idea he was about to witness the demolition of everything he thought our family stood for. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. With the cold precision of a bank manager presenting a foreclosure, I began my case. I had a file on the coffee table. One by one, I laid out the exhibits. First, a copy of their fraudulent second mortgage application, the lies about their income highlighted in yellow. Next, David Chen's complete report on the Prestige Capital Ventures Ponzi scheme, detailing how they had been duped and the full extent of their financial ruin. Finally, I presented a timeline I had created myself, showing their escalating credit card debt and desperate cash withdrawals. I presented it all without a trace of anger in my voice. My tone was one of devastating clarity. This wasn't a mother scolding her child. It was a professional outlining the facts of a case. I watched my brother's face as I spoke. I saw his initial concern for his niece curdle into confusion, then harden into disbelief. His lawyer's mind was connecting the dots, seeing the pattern of deception and desperation. He looked from the papers to Jolie's tear-streaked face and back again. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the shame of it all. When I finished, a terrible silence descended. It was Robert who broke it. He turned to Jolie, his voice usually so steady now trembling with a rage that was terrifying to behold. He asked her how she could have done this, how she could have lied, how she could have gotten into such a mess. And then he asked the question that landed like a physical blow. He wanted to know how she planned to hide all of this. He looked at me then, at her, and his face went white as a terrible understanding dawned. He asked, his voice now a horrified whisper, if she had tried to hide it by killing her own mother. His condemnation was the true punishment. It wasn't my anger she had to face, but the judgment of the family itself, embodied by the man she had respected and admired her whole life. His disgust, his disappointment, that was the social death she had feared all along. Any shred of justification she might have clung to, any story she told herself about protecting her family, was incinerated in the fire of his words. Then, after letting that horror sink in, I delivered the final crushing blow. I reached into my file and placed a small, sealed evidence bag on the coffee table. Inside was the wine-stained napkin from the restaurant. I told them that now we would discuss the attempted murder. I explained everything, the waiter's warning, the bitter, metallic taste of the wine. Robert looked like he was going to be sick. Jolie just stared, her eyes empty. I then announced that I had already met with my lawyer. The will they were so concerned about had been irrevocably changed. Jolie was disinherited completely, but I wasn't finished. I explained that I had established a new trust in my own name. Her inheritance, the money she was willing to kill for, would be used to fund an advocacy group for victims of financial fraud. She would never see a single dime. But the money would be used to help people who, like her, had been ruined by scams like Prestige Capital Ventures. The consequences were not cruel, but they were absolute, proportionate, inescapable, and just. I had taken her desperate, ugly act and transformed it into a legacy of protection for others. That was a justice far more profound than simply cutting her out of my life. The silence that fell after my judgment was delivered was heavier than a tombstone. There were no more tears from Jolie, only a hollow, vacant stare. Mark seemed to shrink into himself, a man utterly broken. My brother Robert finally escorted them out, his face etched with a grief and shame so profound I knew our family would never be the same. He and I didn't say much after they left. We didn't need to. He just squeezed my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes, and left me alone in the quiet of my new reality. The fallout was exactly as you'd expect in a place like Westchester, where appearances are everything. The foreclosure notice went up on their door a week later. The news of their financial collapse spread through the community like wildfire, a delicious piece of gossip whispered over lattes at the country club and in the aisles of the organic market. They became social pariahs overnight. The friends who had once envied their perfect life now crossed the street to avoid them. All the things Jolie had been willing to kill to prevent the public humiliation, the loss of status came to pass anyway. Not because of some outside force, but as a direct and unavoidable consequence of her own choices. In the face of their ruin, they chose divergent paths. I heard from Robert that Mark, broken and deeply ashamed, left Jolie within the month. He moved out of state, taking a manual labor job, trying to rebuild a life from the ground up, away from the judgment and the shame. He accepted his part in it and chose to start over with nothing. Jolie, however, chose a different path. She remained bitter, steeped in a state of complete denial. She sent me a few rambling, self-pitying emails, attempting what I suppose she thought were apologies. They were filled with justifications, blaming the slick investment manager, the pressure of her community, and most of all me for not bailing her out, for overreacting. She never once took true accountability. She had learned nothing. In contrast, I was finally thriving. The first thing I did was put my large family home on the market. It was full of memories, yes, but some of them were now tainted. Selling it wasn't an act of sadness. It was an act of liberation, a final severing of ties to the pain of the past. I bought a smaller, beautiful condominium overlooking the Hudson River and began to build a new life. I threw myself into the fraud victim advocacy group my new trust was funding. I found that my old skills as a bank manager spotting red flags, untangling complex finances, offering clear-headed advice were invaluable. I was helping people navigate the same kind of traps that had ensnared my daughter, transforming my personal trauma into a public service. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected and made new ones at the center. My life, which had become so quiet in retirement, was suddenly richer and more authentic than it had been in years. Months later, I was sitting at an outdoor cafe, the autumn sun warm on my face. Across from me was the young waiter who had saved my life. His name was Leo. He was telling me about his first semester of college, his eyes bright with excitement. The trust I'd set up for fraud victims had a small discretionary fund, and I'd used it to pay for his tuition. He tried to thank me again, but I just smiled and told him that courage and integrity should be rewarded. As he talked about his classes, I looked around. A few tables over two of my friends from the advocacy group waved at me. The life I had built was one of peace, purpose, and genuine connection. I had transformed the ugliest betrayal imaginable into a legacy of wisdom and protection. In the end, I had learned that true wealth isn't something you can inherit or steal. It's built from resilience forged in integrity and measured in the peace you find in a life well lived. I had found my peace while my daughter had created her own lasting self-inflicted exile. Elaine's story teaches a profound lesson about the nature of betrayal and resilience. It shows that true strength isn't just about weathering an attack, but about how one chooses to redefine their life in its aftermath. Understanding the desperation that drove her daughter didn't excuse the horrific act, but it allowed Elaine to forge a justice that was wiser than simple revenge. She transformed her pain into a shield for others, proving that our greatest purpose can often be found in our deepest wounds. Her journey reminds us that true peace is not inherited, but built with integrity.